The wind howled across the icy plains, carrying a cold so sharp it burned Kale's face through his helmet. He had seen many frozen worlds during his years as a galactic veteran, but this one felt emptier than most. The sun barely rose over the horizon, casting long shadows on the white expanse. Kale's boots crunched in the hard ice as he trudged forward, scanning the landscape with his thermal scanner. He had been sent to survey this region for mineral deposits, but something in the air made him pause. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, carried over the wind. He stopped and lifted his head, straining to listen. The sound came again, soft, desperate, and almost human in its tone. Kale frowned. There shouldn't be anyone out here. He followed the sound carefully, moving slowly to avoid slipping on hidden ice. The cries grew louder, and now he could hear multiple voices, small, high-pitched, and weak. Something alive was trapped out here. Kale's veteran instincts kicked in. He had faced battlefields where the wounded were left behind, but he had never ignored a call for help. Pushing through a ridge of ice, Kale spotted a faint glow beneath the snow. He knelt and brushed away the frost with gloved hands. Beneath the icy layer were tiny dragon-like creatures struggling to breathe. Their wings were folded tightly against their bodies, their scales dim under the frost. One of them moved weakly, trying to lift its head, but it fell back onto the ice. Kale's heart clenched. These creatures were dying and no one else was around to help. He quickly scanned them with his portable device. Their bodies were losing heat fast, and their vitals were weak but detectable. If he didn't act, they wouldn't survive the night. "Hang on," he whispered, brushing his gloved hand over the largest creature. It flinched, eyes opening slowly. They were wide and golden, filled with confusion and fear. Kale could feel the intelligence in their gaze. These weren't just animals, they were thinking, aware beings, and they needed him. He reached into his pack and pulled out emergency thermal blankets and a small portable heater. Wrapping the creatures gently, he began to thaw the ice around their wings and bodies. Steam rose as the frost melted, and the creatures trembled with the sudden warmth. Kale worked carefully, speaking softly. "It's okay. You're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you." One of the smaller creatures let out a soft whine. Kale held it close, feeling its tiny heartbeat against his chest plate. It was weak, but it was alive. The others shifted slightly, watching him with cautious eyes. Kale realized that trust would not come easily. These creatures had suffered, and now, in a world that had abandoned them, they were seeing a human willing to help. The sky darkened as clouds moved overhead. A storm was coming, and Kale knew they couldn't stay out in the open. He carefully lifted the creatures one by one onto his sled. Their weight was light but fragile. He wrapped them in the blankets, adjusting the heater to maintain warmth. As he moved toward his shelter, the creatures stirred, weakly trying to lift their heads. Kale encouraged them with soft words. "We're almost there. Just a little further." The wind picked up, pushing snow against his face, but he kept moving. Each step felt like a promise. He would not abandon them like the world had. Inside his shelter, Kale set the creatures down on a heated mat. They blinked, looking around the small space filled with warm light and safe corners. One of them stepped forward, hesitantly sniffing the air. Kale knelt, extending a hand. "You're safe. You can rest now." The dragon-like creatures relaxed slightly, curling together near the heat source. Kale watched them, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. They were far from home, in a world they didn't understand, and he was the only one who could protect them. Hours passed, and the creatures began to show signs of recovery. Their scales shimmered faintly under the warm light, and their breathing became steadier. Kale took a seat nearby, exhausted but alert. He studied them carefully. They were young, but their eyes held wisdom far beyond their size. Something told him they were survivors, capable of adapting and learning. Kale knew the danger wasn't over. The ice world was harsh, predators could be nearby, and other humans might stumble upon them, unaware of the creature's importance. But for now, in this small shelter, they were safe. And that was enough to keep him going. As night fell, Kale watched the creatures sleep, their soft glow lighting the room. He thought about the long years he had spent in battle, the lives lost and the horrors he had seen. None of it had prepared him for this quiet moment, saving beings who had no one else to rely on. He reached out and brushed a hand over one of their tiny heads. "We'll get through this," he said quietly. "I promise. I'll make sure you survive." Outside, the wind howled over the frozen plains, but inside the shelter there was warmth, hope, and the beginning of a bond that could change everything. For Kale, this was more than a mission. It was a chance to do what he had always wanted, to protect, to save, and to make a difference where no one else could. And for the creatures, It was the first time in their short lives that they felt safety, warmth, and a human willing to fight for them. The frozen calls that had brought Kale here were not just cries of desperation. They were the start of something new, a story of survival, trust, and an unbreakable connection between human and alien. The storm raged outside, but inside, life had returned to the ice. The shelter was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional groan of the ice shifting outside. Kale sat cross-legged beside the small dragon-like creatures, watching their breathing. The warmth from the heater made the air foggy, but the creatures seemed calmer. Their scales shimmered faintly in the dim light, and their golden eyes flickered as they slowly moved. Kale reached into his pack and pulled out a small container of nutrient gel. He had no idea if they would eat it, but it was energy-rich and safe. Kneeling carefully, he offered it to the smallest creature first. It sniffed, hesitated, then touched it with its tiny tongue. Slowly it began to lap at the gel. Kale smiled. One small victory, but it mattered. The others watched him warily. Kale spoke softly, keeping his voice calm. "It's okay. Eat when you're ready. You're safe here." He didn't rush them. Trust would take time, and he had learned in the military that patience could save lives. As the hours passed, the creatures began to thaw both physically and emotionally. Their wings stretched slightly, claws flexing after hours of being trapped in ice. One of the larger dragons hissed softly, then made a sound like a whine. Kale crouched closer. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The dragon lowered its head and sniffed his hand. A tiny spark of trust had appeared. Kale observed them closely. Their scales carried faint glowing lines, strange ancient markings that pulsed when they moved. He didn't know what they meant, but he sensed that the creatures were intelligent and aware of their own history. He made a mental note to study them more once they were stronger. The storm outside continued, snow lashing against the shelter, but inside, warmth filled the small space. Kale had managed to create a stable microclimate with the heater and insulated walls. The creatures huddled together near the heat, their bodies slowly regaining strength. Kale fed them small portions of gel and water at intervals, careful not to overwhelm them. As the day turned to evening, the creatures became more active. One of the middle-sized dragons lifted its head fully and tilted it, staring at Kale with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Kale returned the gaze steadily. He knew that in the wild, sudden movements could trigger fear or aggression. "I'm here to help, not hurt," he whispered. The dragon blinked slowly, a small sign of acceptance. Kale realized that their survival depended on more than just warmth and food. They needed reassurance, protection, and a sense of safety. He built small barriers using supplies from his pack, creating corners where the dragons could feel secure. He spoke softly as he worked, narrating his actions. "This will be your space. You can rest here without worry." One of the creatures ventured out further, moving slowly toward the center of the shelter. Kale remained still, letting it approach. It sniffed the air, then the heater, then his hand. When it finally brushed against him, Kale felt a shiver of relief. Trust was beginning to form. As night fell, the creatures settled into their new space. Their breathing was steady, and their scales glowed softly in the heater's light. Kale sat back, exhausted but satisfied. He knew the journey was far from over, but this was the first real step toward survival. He thought about their situation. Out here in the ice, no one else would have found them in time. They were lucky he had been there, but luck alone would not be enough. They needed care, training, and protection if they were going to survive longer. Kale resolved to stay with them as long as necessary. During the night, one of the smaller dragons whimpered softly. Kale leaned over and touched it gently. "It's okay. You're not alone," he whispered. The creature shivered, then relaxed against him. The bond was fragile but growing stronger. He realized that each gesture, each act of kindness, mattered more than he had expected. By morning, the dragons had moved more freely. Their wings stretched, their claws dug into the soft bedding, and their eyes shone with more awareness. Kale prepared another round of nutrient gel and water, this time adding a small amount of warmth from his hands. They accepted it more willingly, no longer just out of desperation. Kale spoke to them as he worked. "You're safe here. You'll eat, you'll rest, and you'll get stronger. I'll make sure of it." The dragons seemed to respond in small ways, tilting their heads, blinking slowly, even nudging each other. Kale realized they were learning from each other and from him. They were forming a small, fragile community. The storm had passed, leaving a quiet, frozen landscape outside. Kale looked out at the ice, thinking about the world beyond. He knew other dangers could come, but for now they had time. Time to recover, time to heal, and time to learn. As the day went on, Kale continued to nurture them. He discovered that the dragons were intelligent and curious. They examined their surroundings carefully, tested the warmth of the heater, and explored the corners of the shelter. Kale encouraged them gently, allowing them to move at their own pace. By evening, all the dragons were awake and alert. Their scales had regained some brightness, their wings were more flexible, and their breathing was steady. Kale felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a growing responsibility. He was no longer just a veteran on patrol, he was a protector, a teacher, and a guardian for these fragile beings. The dragons looked at him with eyes that seemed to understand gratitude, or at least recognition. Kale knew it was the beginning of something more than survival. It was the start of trust, friendship, and perhaps even a new family. As night fell, the heater's glow reflected on their shimmering scales. Kale leaned back, exhausted but hopeful. For the first time in days, the dragons were safe, fed, and warm. Thawing hope had returned to their frozen world, and Kale realized that saving them was only the first step. Outside, the wind swept across the ice plains, but inside the shelter, warmth, life, and trust had begun to grow. Kale watched the dragons settle together near the heater, their small bodies glowing softly. He whispered, "Rest now. Tomorrow we start again." And for the first time, the creatures felt safe enough to believe that someone could truly care for them. The shelter was quiet in the morning light, broken only by the soft rustle of dragon wings and the faint hiss of the heater. Kale watched the small creatures move carefully around their warm space. They were stronger than yesterday but still cautious, eyes flicking nervously toward every sound. He knew trust would take time and he needed to find a way to communicate. Kale had fought wars across the galaxy and had trained in countless survival techniques, but this was different. These beings were intelligent but their language was unknown. They made chirps, whistles, and soft hums that carried meaning, but Kale couldn't understand it yet. He had to learn and they had to learn him. He began with gestures, pointing to the heater and mimicking actions. "Warm," he said, holding his hands near the heater. One of the dragons tilted its head, blinking slowly. It stepped closer, testing the warmth. Kale smiled, noting the first sign of comprehension. Next he offered the nutrient gel again. This time he tapped on the container and said, "Eat." The smallest dragon approached cautiously, but this time it waited for Kale's approval before tasting. Kale nodded, encouraging it softly. Slowly the others followed suit. The pattern of trust was forming. Over the next hours, Kale introduced more gestures. He tapped on the blankets and said, "Rest." He mimicked drinking from a cup, saying, "Drink." Gradually the dragons began to respond, lifting heads, blinking, and moving closer to him. Communication was slow, but each small success built confidence, for both Kale and the creatures. While observing them, Kale noticed something remarkable. Their scales glowed faintly in patterns, shifting as they moved or made sounds. Sometimes the glow pulsed faster when they were excited, or slowed when they were calm. He realized that this was their way of expressing emotions. The glowing patterns were a kind of language, a code he had to learn. Kale spent time watching, matching gestures to the glowing pulses. When he pointed to the heater, the glow shifted slightly. When he offered food, it changed again. It was a form of communication, and he began to understand their moods through these subtle changes. It was slow work, but he felt a thrill. He had fought enemies in war, but this challenge, learning an entirely new language without words, was something else entirely. The dragons in turn were learning him. They began to mimic some of his gestures, tapping on objects or nudging him to show interest. One dragon pressed against his arm, then tapped the food container, clearly asking for more. Kale laughed quietly, realizing they were teaching him as much as he was teaching them. Kale also discovered that their eyes carried meaning. A slow blink indicated calm, while a wide stare showed alertness or fear. He began using eye contact to reassure them, pairing gestures with looks. Gradually, a system developed. Gestures, glowing scales, eye movements, and sounds all combining to create understanding. One evening, Kale noticed a dragon making a small rhythmic chirp while its scales pulsed in a repeating pattern. He mimicked it, tapping his fingers in rhythm and making the same sound. The dragon froze, then repeated the pattern. Kale realized this was their attempt at greeting him, a sign of recognition and trust. He returned the gesture, and the other dragons watched curiously, some joining in. By the next day, communication had grown stronger. Kale could tell which dragons were hungry, tired, or anxious. The dragons understood basic concepts from his gestures and sounds. When he pointed outside, they understood, "Go explore cautiously." When he tapped the blankets, they curled up to rest. It was a fragile but growing system. Kale took time to observe their social interactions too. They were not solitary, they comforted each other, shared warmth, and even seemed to play, chasing each other around the shelter. He realized that forming trust with him was only part of their recovery. They needed to trust each other as well. One of the younger dragons had difficulty moving its wings. Kale showed it how to stretch carefully, tapping his own arm and saying, "Stretch." The dragon followed, and gradually it learned to move more freely. The others watched and copied. Communication had turned into teaching and learning, a shared bond forming between human and dragons. The bond deepened further when Kale began telling them stories of his past, not with words they could understand, but with gestures, sounds, and his voice's tone. He mimicked walking, fighting, and surviving. The dragons watched intently, sometimes chirping in response, as if understanding the meaning behind his actions. Kale realized they were learning history, not just survival, and it made him feel a connection unlike any he had experienced before. By the evening, Kale sat in the center of the shelter, surrounded by the dragons. They responded to his gestures, glowed in patterns that reflected their emotions, and made soft chirps that sounded almost like conversation. He smiled, feeling the first real sense of partnership. They were no longer just creatures he had saved, they were beings capable of understanding and interacting with him. The wind outside blew hard, but inside there was warmth, life, and a shared understanding that went beyond words. Kale reached out to the smallest dragon, which leaned against him, scales glowing softly. "We understand each other now," he whispered. "We'll get through this together." For the dragons, this was more than survival, it was trust, learning, and hope. For Kale, it was a lesson in patience, empathy, and the quiet power of connection. Together, they were building a language, a bond, and a future that neither had known before. As night fell, the shelter glowed softly with dragon light, a small sanctuary where trust and understanding had begun to thrive. Kale knew that tomorrow and every day after, they would continue learning together, growing stronger as a team. And for the first time he felt that the creatures were not just alive, they were thriving. The frozen world outside was still dangerous, but inside, the human veteran and the alien dragons had found a way to communicate, and with it, a reason to hope. The morning light reflected off the icy plains, making the snow sparkle like millions of tiny stars. Kale was preparing breakfast for the dragons when a sudden vibration ran through the ice under his boots. He froze. Something was moving in the distance, a mechanical hum that didn't belong to the wind or the storm. The dragons perked up immediately. Their wings lifted, claws digging into the icy floor, eyes glowing with alertness. One of the larger dragons hissed, a warning sound that made Kale's chest tighten. He had hoped the ice world's isolation would keep them safe, but danger was returning faster than he could have imagined. Through the scope of his binoculars, Kale saw dark shapes moving across the snow, scavenger drones, likely sent by a mercenary group seeking rare alien life for profit. He cursed under his breath. These creatures were attracted by the dragon's glowing scales, and they would not hesitate to capture or destroy them. Kale's years as a veteran had taught him how to handle threats, but this was different. He had to protect them, not just fight. He turned to the dragons. "Stay close. We have work to do," he said firmly. The dragons responded immediately, moving nearer, forming a small protective cluster around him. Their trust in him was strong now, but he knew they were vulnerable. He had to act quickly. Kale grabbed his survival pack, pulling out lightweight barricades and some basic traps he had built for ice patrols. He pointed to the openings of the shelter. "We defend here. You watch the outside," he instructed, using gestures and eye contact. The dragons chirped and glowed in response, seemingly understanding his plan. He set up the barricades while the dragons took positions near the entrances, wings ready to strike or fly if needed. Kale adjusted his sensors and weapons, though he hoped they wouldn't need to fire. He had learned that his human tactics combined with their alien instincts could give them the edge. The drones came closer, scanning for heat signatures. Kale held his breath, watching their movements. The dragons shifted, low growls vibrating through the shelter. One of them, the largest, stretched its wings, showing its full size, scales shimmering bright in the cold morning light. The drones hesitated, unsure of the strange, glowing creatures. Kale nodded to the dragons. With a quick whistle and gesture, Kale signaled them to move. The dragons leapt toward the drones, agile and precise. They dodged the first attacks, claws striking the metal machines, their glowing tails whipping sparks. Kale used his own skill, tossing traps in the drones' paths, freezing some in place with temporary ice nets. Together they became a coordinated team, human and alien working in unison. The battle was tense but brief. The drones had superior technology, but the dragons' agility and Kale's strategy outmatched them. One drone exploded with a small flare, melting snow around it, while another fell, trapped by Kale's ice net. The dragons darted around, confusing the remaining drones, then circled back to Kale, ready for the next move. Kale could see the intelligence in their movements. They were learning from him, adjusting their attacks and even signaling each other with chirps and glowing flashes. He realized that his efforts to teach them communication had given them an unexpected advantage in survival. The bond they shared was more than trust. It was teamwork, and it made them stronger than he had imagined. After several tense minutes, the last of the drones retreated. Kale exhaled, sweat forming under his layers despite the cold. The dragons chirped softly, glowing dimly in a pattern that Kale had learned meant relief. They had survived their first real test together. Kale knelt beside the largest dragon, patting its scaled shoulder. "You did well." "We did well," he said. The dragon lowered its head, nudging him gently. Kale smiled. Their connection was undeniable. He realized that these creatures were no longer just survivors. They were fighters, capable of defending themselves and each other under his guidance. As the day went on, Kale and the dragons repaired the shelter and reinforced their defenses. They explored the surrounding ice plains, noting potential threats and safe areas. Kale taught the dragons how to use terrain to their advantage, showing them ice ridges, hidden crevices, and snowdrifts perfect for ambush or cover. The dragons learned quickly, their trust in him translating into confidence in themselves. By evening, the ice world was calm again, but Kale knew it was only temporary. Other threats could arrive at any moment, drawn by the dragon's unique presence. He looked at the creatures now resting near the heater, wings folded but alert. He felt a sense of pride and responsibility. He had saved them once, but now he was preparing them to survive in a world that would never leave them untouched. The dragon's eyes flicked to him occasionally, glowing softly. Kale understood their silent message: "We are ready to fight, but we need you." And he knew he would never abandon them. Outside, the ice shimmered under the setting sun, peaceful for now, but the hum of machines in the distance reminded Kale that danger was always near. He would be vigilant, guiding these creatures, teaching them and protecting them. Together they had faced the first threat, and survived. And Kale knew that as long as they stayed united, nothing in the frozen world could break them. That night, the dragons slept more soundly, wings tucked, scales dimmed in exhaustion. Kale sat nearby, thinking about the coming days. They had won this fight, but the world was still harsh and unforgiving. He was their guardian, their teacher, and their friend. And they were no longer just creatures in the ice. They were a team bound by trust, courage, and survival. The wind whispered outside, but inside the shelter, life had become strong. Kale touched one of the smaller dragons gently. "We survived today," he said softly. "Tomorrow we grow stronger." And the dragons responded in their way, a chorus of chirps and glowing patterns as if to say, "Together we are ready." The first light of dawn broke across the ice plains, painting everything in pale gold. Kale stepped outside the shelter, scanning the horizon. The world was quiet now, peaceful after the storm and the threats that had come before. He breathed deeply, the cold air sharp in his lungs, and felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. Around him, the dragons stirred, stretching their wings and blinking in the morning light. For weeks they had recovered, grown stronger, and learned to trust. They moved with confidence now, exploring the small territory around the shelter and testing their wings. Kale watched them carefully, proud of their progress. They were no longer weak or fearful. Each dragon had a personality, a rhythm, and a spark of intelligence that made them unique. Kale began preparing for a larger journey. The ice world was harsh, and staying in one place could be dangerous. There were predators, and other scavengers could appear at any time. He decided it was time to move beyond the ice, to find a safer place where the dragons could thrive. He packed supplies, food, and heat packs for the journey. The dragons gathered near him, chirping and glowing softly. Kale knelt, speaking in gentle gestures and words. "We leave soon. We go to a new place. You will be safe and we will stay together." The dragons responded with a chorus of soft sounds and shifting light, their way of agreeing and showing trust. As they began their journey across the frozen plains, Kale led carefully, showing the dragons how to navigate the ice safely. They followed his guidance, wings strong, eyes alert. The cold wind bit at their scales, but they pressed forward, learning from each step. Kale could feel their excitement and cautious joy. They were explorers now, discovering a world that had once seemed only dangerous. During the trip, they encountered small obstacles: cracks in the ice, thin layers of frozen lakes, and hidden crevices. Kale showed them how to jump safely, test the ice, and use their strength to help each other. The dragons learned quickly and soon they were moving with skill and precision. Kale smiled, realizing that they were not just surviving, they were thriving under his guidance. At one point, Kale and the dragons came upon a frozen canyon. Its walls shimmered with ice crystals, creating a dazzling sight. The dragons hesitated at the edge, uncertain of the drop. Kale stepped forward, tapping the ground and showing them the path carefully. Slowly, one dragon leapt, wings spreading wide. The others followed. Kale moved alongside them, steadying their balance when needed. They landed safely and the dragons chirped in delight. It was a small victory but a meaningful one. By evening, they reached a sheltered valley beyond the plains. The area was surrounded by rocky hills, providing protection from winds and potential threats. Kale knew this could be their new home. He set up a temporary camp, building warmth with portable heaters and insulating the area. The dragons explored, sniffing the rocks, curling near the heat sources, and glowing faintly with curiosity. Kale watched them, realizing how far they had come. When he first found them frozen and barely alive, they had been frightened and fragile. Now they were strong, aware, and trusting. He felt a deep sense of pride and connection. These creatures had become more than companions, they were family. That night, Kale sat near the dragons, telling stories of his past through gestures, soft sounds, and the tone of his voice. The dragons listened, curling closer to him, scales glowing softly in response. They chirped occasionally, their lights pulsing in patterns that Kale had come to understand as curiosity or recognition. It was not words, but it was communication, and it was enough. Over the next days, Kale and the dragons settled into their new home. They built nests, explored the surrounding hills, and discovered sources of food and water. Kale taught them how to hunt small animals and find edible plants. The dragons learned quickly, and soon they were moving confidently, hunting and exploring under Kale's guidance. Kale realized that this ice world was no longer a prison. It had become a place of growth, learning, and family. The dragons no longer depended solely on him. They had learned to rely on each other, using their instincts and intelligence. And yet, Kale was still their anchor, the one who had saved them and continued to guide them through challenges. One evening, Kale looked out over the valley as the sun dipped below the horizon. The dragons perched on rocky ledges, wings folded, eyes glowing softly. He felt a quiet satisfaction. He had come to this frozen world alone, a veteran carrying the weight of past battles. Now he was not alone. He had companions, protectors, and friends who trusted him completely. The dragons chirped in unison, a soft, glowing chorus that seemed almost musical. Kale smiled, reaching out to touch the largest dragon's scaled shoulder. "We are together," he whispered. "We will stay together." The dragon nudged him gently, scales brightening in acknowledgement. From that day forward, Kale and the dragons built their life together. They explored the icy plains, defended their home from occasional threats, and discovered hidden beauty in a world that had once seemed only harsh and deadly. Kale taught them, protected them, and learned from them in return. The bond between human and alien had grown into something strong and unbreakable. The ice world no longer felt empty. It was filled with life, warmth, and hope. Kale and his dragons had become a new family, one forged through trust, survival, and the courage to face danger together. The creatures had once been lost, alone, and abandoned, but now they had a home, a protector, and a companion who cared as much for them as they did for him. Kale looked at the dragons, wings stretched in the cold air, eyes glowing softly. He knew their journey was just beginning. Together they could face anything, the ice, the storms, and any danger that might come. And together they had found something stronger than survival: family, hope, and a life worth living. The stars began to shine above the icy valley, reflecting in the dragon's scales. Kale leaned back, content, as the creatures curled around each other near the heat. They had survived the ice, the storms, and threats from the world beyond. And now they had each other, a human and his alien dragons, a family beyond the frozen expanse, ready for the future. The wind whispered outside, but inside their valley, life, trust, and warmth glowed brightly. They were home.